you already know who these people are, but nonetheless, I'm going to introduce them again. Alison Stuart, whose novel, The Goldminer's Sister, let's see if I can get this up correctly, was published by Harlequin Mirror just this week. It's her second book with us, a follow-up to The Postmistress, which came out last year and was shortlisted in the Australian Romance Readers Award for Best Historical Romance. Before Alison turned to writing, she had a long and varied career as a lawyer, both in private practice and working with various organisations, including the military, so you better behave yourselves, and emergency services. And Alison lives in a historic town in Victoria. Darry, of course, we have. Darry's book, ELSA GOODY, Bushranger, how was that for a book title? Was published by Harlequin Mirror in May of this year. It's her fifth book with us, following on from Daughter of the Murray, Where the Murray River Runs, The Widow of Ballarat, and The Good Woman of Renmark. And Darry lives and writes on Kangaroo Island in South Australia. So we have a series of questions. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A. As I say, please feel free to add your own questions. And we've already had a couple sent in. So I think we'll just get going. And so, Alison, Darry, what is it that draws you to writing 19th century Australian stories?
Oh, well, I'll go first. I never actually thought I would end up writing 19th century Australian stories, because anybody who knows me knows that my deep and abiding passion is the English Civil War. But what drew me to it really was, firstly, we've done a lot of travelling around Australia, and I realised history at school was very badly taught, and I thought Australian history was so boring and so naff after, there were no civil wars, there were no kings and queens. But one thing I learned was it was about the people. And yes, no, we didn't have the really exciting events, but what we had were the most extraordinary people who did the most extraordinary things in our history to make us the country we are today. I mean, you think about what the First Fleet had to face when they arrived, and from then on, it becomes quite extraordinary. And I think what eventually pushed me over the edge was being asked by an American reader if I could recommend any good Australian historical romances. And that it was before Taya Cooper and Darry had really taken off. And I couldn't find any. And the only one I found was written by an American, set in Melbourne in 1837. And I know people probably heard this story before, but everything about it was wrong. From the heroine and her sister tripping down the main streets of a bustling Melbourne looking for satin dancing slippers to collecting the latest convict off the boat. And it was that more than anything else. It was the reader's comments more than anything else that really incensed me, sort of saying, oh, well, thank you so much for introducing us to this fantastic period of history. We'd love to read more. And but it's all wrong. As a historian, I was appalled. So my husband and I we went camping one weekend, and it was raining, a bit like today. And over a couple of glasses of red wine, I sort of said to him, if I was to write an Australian story, what would it be about? And from that was the origin of me starting the Maidens Creek stories. So that's my sort of how I came to write Australian history stories. So over to you, Darry.
I guess for me, like many of us in the room today anyway, when we were at school, as Alison said, Australian history was very dry and very boring. And I grew up on lots and lots of American TV cowboy shows, and I'm going to mention Bonanza, and I'm going to mention High Chaparral and all of those sort of things. And I started to think from a very young age, where are our guys in the saddle with their rifles and, traveling around, and where's all that stuff? And, as I was the oldest of three kids, and the first time we moved to the country, I was able to appreciate what I had there as opposed to the city. And at the time, and a lot of people would know this story too, when we lived at Swan Hill, they just put the paddle steamer boat, the Gem, in situ along the river. And suddenly I had a portal with which to travel through to another century. And it was like magic for me, because when they first started that, all the buildings were new, as you expect it would be if you lived back in that day, rather than us going to 150-year-old house now and saying, oh gee, the floorboards are creaking. So I was suddenly flung into another century, which I absolutely loved. So I remember saying to Sue Brockhoff, our head of publishing, when I first pitched my first book to her, Australia has her own heroes, and I wanted to find them. So a little bit like Alison, you had to write them. If you wanted to find them, you had to write them yourself. So that's basically why I got into that sort of frontier is the wrong word, pioneering is the wrong word, because I enjoyed the latter half of the 19th century. But it was definitely being able to take that portal through time from, let's say, the 1960s when I lived in Swan Hill back to 1850 and onwards. So that's what set me off.
Okay. And obviously what goes into writing history is research. As Alison has pointed out, it's incredibly frustrating when authors obviously haven't done the research and just get it all completely wrong. So what's your research process? And do you think your stories are realistic?
Well, I'm a historian by trade, I suppose you could say. I have an arts degree in history, so I tend to bring that sort of rigor to my history. It's a matter of pride with me to get it right. Like Darry, I mean, I'm blessed down here in Victoria. We've got Sovereign Hill, and I remember when Sovereign Hill opened in the 1970s, and it was exactly as Darry had described it. Here it was with history brought to life in a really for a visual person, for a really understandable way. And certainly for a lot of the Goldminer's Sister particularly, which was quite technical in terms of sort of what I had to learn about hard rock gold mining in a very short period of time. It was so much easier just to go to Sovereign Hill and see it in the flesh, so as to speak, actually being done. And so that my day at Sovereign Hill was probably the most important piece of research I did for the whole story. Otherwise, the best place to go for research is our own first, what we call primary historical sources. And that's, you find all those in Trove. You find the original newspapers, and you find the most amazing snippets of gossip and little stories in Trove. And
when you say Trove, Alison, that's part of the National Library, is that right?
Yes, I think it's the National Library. Do you use it, Darry?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I couldn't do without it. And just following along again from what Alison said, the snippets of the bits and pieces that might not be the main that you're looking for. If you look just under the piece that you've highlighted for your research, you'll find some delightful snippets of real life that we don't expect to see, certainly not now. Newspapers, whether they're local or national, and a lot of those stories are a lot of those snippets are the things that set me off or give me a little character quirk. I find Trove invaluable, and also because you can drop a search word in, up pops all sorts of things that you can just grasp at your fingertips. Now, as we all suspect, you can spend days and days researching, for instance, when paper bags arrived in the country, to be able to use the two words paper bags in your 1890s story. So you can spend hours and hours looking for what you need, but you'll only use a seamless couple of words to fit in. So it's very important.
And woe betide you if you get it wrong.
Yes.
I had that with the Coles Funny Picture book, which actually wasn't published till 1878, but I really, really wanted to use it in the Postmistress. So I did actually naughtily use it, and my copy editor picked me up on it and said, "You realise this wasn't published till 18? Yes, read the author notes. I put it in there." I know I did the bad thing, and sort of changed his
author notes can cover off a whole gamut of sins, I think.
Well, yeah, I think Darry and I were talking before, and one of the things is we are primarily fiction writers. We're not writing non-fiction, and so we have a little bit of liberty to fiddle around the edges, but I don't. If I do change something like the Coles Funny Picture book, I will note it in the author's notes, because people do notice, and I want to explain that yes, I do understand that I have done this, and I'll only ever do it with very minor things. I'll never change the dates of battles or or when bridges were built or anything like that. But yeah, you do have to be careful, because yeah, it's a matter of personal pride too. I got to get it right. Got to get it right.
We have a question from Lou Bromley. I don't know if Lou's here somewhere in a wave.
Yes, she is.
Hey, hello. In your research, what did you find that surprised you, and what eluded your best efforts?
Well, I can certainly start that one off. In ELSA GOODY Bushranger, I came to learn that the first election in the country that women could vote was in 1896, and the date of that election fell on the 25th of April, which is often lost for obvious reasons now. But it was certainly very fortuitous, and it was also the time of the first referendum. So when I went searching the Robe and district newspapers for the dry old things like where the elections were held, and no, they didn't want them held in the drafty old council buildings, they wanted them held somewhere else, blah, 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 and on it went. And suddenly there was a piece in Trove that said, and the First Lady to cast her vote arrived at the Robe Council, wherever it was, at 9:45 in the morning, to the jeers and the cheers of the gentlemen who lined the path, clapping her along. So I hope she swished her fan and slapped the few as she went. There were catcalls about whether or not she'd vote for the best looking fellow in the you know, who was standing for election, and so on and so forth, but nobody had her name. So I went looking for her name everywhere to ensure that I wasn't going to step on her toes when I allowed ELSA GOODY to be that woman who first arrived at 9:45 in the morning. So that eluded me, and it's also eluded the State Library of South Australia and the Electoral Commission in their history. They don't have records of who was that first woman to cast her vote.
Well, that's fascinating, Darry. Well, I mean, lots of anything you want to know about hard rock gold mining, I'm your girl. But the most, I think probably the most surprising thing I learned was actually not so much with the Goldminer's Sister, but also when I was researching the Postmistress, where I came across the story of the smallpox victim who came to Walhalla. And that is an entirely true story, that this woman had contracted smallpox in Melbourne, and she and her family arrived in Walhalla and promptly put up in a hotel. I mean, does any of this sound a little bit familiar? And they the local town dignitaries all said, you've got to stay in quarantine in the hotel, but they escaped and went to their own home, which was slightly on the outskirts of Walhalla. And the solution that I mean, it was deadly. If it had got into the town, it would have wiped out the entire valley. So they did exactly what they did in the book. They built an 8-foot wall around the house, and they kept the family in that house. The woman died, sadly. Surprisingly, her husband and child and the maid who was in the house with them survived. And they were kept in quarantine after the woman died to make sure that they were all clear of the smallpox. And as soon as they came out, they were stripped naked. They were told to come out with no clothes on, and as soon as they were out, the house was burned completely to the ground. And the poor woman herself, they couldn't carry her body down through the town to the cemetery because the risk of smallpox was so high. So she ended up being buried in a 10-foot grave at the top of the nearest hill, which is actually very near, if you know Walhalla, very near to the cricket ground. And you can still see her grave up there to this day. But I wrote that obviously long before the current situation developed, but it goes to show that back in the 1860s, it was the 1860s, slightly before my story was set, that they understood about quarantine, and they understood about the importance of keeping infection out of the town. So I thought that was an amazing story, absolutely amazing. Oh, I've stunned people into silence.
It's a while since I've read The Postmistress, but when you talk about it, it just is like, oh, you know, it's a complete hit to the gut that happened. There's a bit of a segue here, and I guess my next question about, life was really hard for women in those days. I'm feeling quite whingy myself all the time at the moment, but I'm actually aware that I have my dishwasher and my washing machine and food at the supermarket, etc. ELSA Goody is literally scrabbling around in the dirt trying to make a living. Eliza, in your book, Alison, is a little bit better off. But do you think your characters and stories are realistic, given how rough life was?
As much as possible, I want to be able to give my story an interesting person. And so to some extent, she mustn't be what I'm going to term dirt poor, because there certainly were an awful lot of people who were dirt poor and have had absolutely no way of getting out of their situation, no education, and no real life skills to move forward. So for my characters, I like to lift them a little bit up out of a rock bottom, if you like, socioeconomic group, and give them a little bit of education, enough for them to be able to read the newspaper and so on and so forth. But if you were a woman on your own with no means of support and no farm to be able to work, even though you knew you could, you were on the brink of starvation, and or worse, where you might have to look for work that put you on your back most of the time. So I try to make sure that my stories are a little bit up from that very, very rock bottom point, and also where when you've got a little bit of a fire in your belly, you can actually go somewhere with it. Whereas if you're totally and utterly oppressed by your situation, you probably just give in to it.
Yeah, you see, I've got a character in the Goldminer's Sister. No, many of you haven't read it yet. Who's known in the town as Mad Annie, who lives with her daughter on the outskirts of town, and she runs a grog shop. And they have nothing. She literally only has the power in her two hands to brew beer and cook food for passers-by. And I absolutely agree with you, Darry, that for Mad Annie can see no way out of her situation. She sees no future for her daughter beyond what she has herself. And so when Charlie, the daughter, is offered a bright light, it's almost too much for Annie to cope with. She doesn't want to even consider that the child might be given hope. And I think that is such a, I think there were so many like that. You see the pictures of say the Mallee farmers living in huts made out of beaten iron petrol tins, and just the sheer and utter poverty that they lived in. And I think you portray that really well in ELSA, Darry. I could feel that dirt under my fingernails. Yeah. But yes, I like you. I think I prefer to bring my women up a little bit in status and give them. But that for Eliza, there's no. They're a family that have fallen from good fortune. Her only options are to be a governess or a companion. Or a school teacher, which is what she ends up being, and Eliza likewise. Adelaide in The Postmistress, a very strong woman who sort of managed to sort of get a little bit, became a postmistress probably a little bit before women were actually made into postmistresses, but it was something a woman could do on her own. And Rosie the baker in ELSA too. I mean, that's something the women had to find their way. So to answer your question, I think we do our best to make them as realistic as we can.
Fair enough. We have an audience question, and I'm sorry, it just says from iPhone. I'm sorry if I'm not acknowledging you properly, it's just all I've got. How do you develop your characters, and do they change as the story evolves?
Well, I'll go first on that one. How do you develop your characters? I think I start with a rough idea because it's romance. I like to have a hero and a heroine. So I generally have a sort of rough idea of how I want them to be. And do they change? Oh my word, they do. Yes. Caleb in The Postmistress started off as a lawyer. ended up as a doctor. So they, you know, Darry will know what I mean when I say, you know, you're doing well when your characters are actually talking to you and telling you their own life stories. I know that sounds completely mad, but that is kind of how they work. They come to you with their own stories, and they tug at your sleeve and or lean over your shoulder and say, well, actually, no, I wouldn't do that. I would do that because of someone. Where did that come from? You know, it's yeah, so they're kind of self-developing characters, really. Darry?
Yes, I think the first thing that happens for me is a name, and I don't often have to look terribly hard for a name. What I do ask myself is, where is the next story? And then not too long after that, might be a couple of days, a couple of good nights sleep, I get a name. And from the name seems to grow the character. Now, when I open a book, I try to have that changing of life situation, where a character has been la-di-da up to a point, then you drop a big bomb on him or her, and something has to happen. So from there, the situation that they find themselves in move their characters forward, and who they are as people, they evolve over the time, and certainly by way of which the circumstance affects them. As Alison said, we are quite mad. I put my hand up for that. I'll wake up in the middle of the night with a character saying to me, "You've got me all wrong, you dodo. You can't do that. We're going to have to backtrack 3 chapters to drop in a bit of a hint so that we can get me right." Now, that happens all the time. In fact, just a bit of in-house publishing stuff. I've got a story that's just gone through with a request for acceptance, and I know already I've got to write notes to fix this and that, because when it comes back to me, the character has asked that I do this for him to get him right. So they are real people. They wander along beside me, and I certainly get hints about which way they'd like to go and who they are and what's bothered them in the past, which certainly helps to round out their characters.
Yeah, I agree. They have to be given baggage. In writing terms, we call it a wound that they've got to work with. And if they were sort of came from a happy family and had lived happily ever all their lives, they'd be pretty boring characters, really. So yes, they've got to be troubled, deeply troubled.
Yeah, you've got to give them some hell, I think, to struggle through.
Drop a bomb.
Turning to something, well, as Alison said, these are romances. What is the most romantic scene or moment that you've ever written? Someone's going to be brave and
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to call the fifth or something. I'm not answering that.
Oh, that's rough. Oh dear. Yeah, I struggle with the romantic scenes. I'm a really good action, but I struggle with the lovey kissy bits. I get all embarrassed.
I think when we talk romance, everybody has their own idea about it. But in a manuscript that I've got on the go at the moment, there certainly is that depth of feeling between the 2 characters, but absolutely nothing has happened. And I think if I were to try and say what would be my best romantics, it would be the dialogue between these 2 within the context of the story means so much to both of them, but there's no physical contact whatsoever. So I think it's a place where you can feel, where your emotional depth is drawn. The kissy stuff, it's that real depth of feeling that I might be able to invoke. That means something to me. And you know, looking back into ancient history, I really have to remember what on earth that felt like to bring it forward. So I can't say that I would talk to let's call it the kissy stuff, because that's not where I find depth of emotion is.
Okay,
absolutely.
Giving me goosebumps. what
I
you're
absolutely agree
describing.
with you. Sorry, cut across you there, Nicola.
No, it's fine.
Just to expand a little bit on what Darry just said, because I'm sitting here nodding. Yeah, it's the scenes where they're sitting together, just talking, and it's where they start to unpeel the layers of the onion and reveal a little bit of their own vulnerabilities. To me, those are the romantic scenes. Those are the emotional scenes, when they're just starting to let the other person in. And I love writing those scenes. I really do.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we all really enjoy reading them too, which is probably why I'm getting goosebumps. Next question, a slightly silly one, but hey, do you fall in love with your romantic heroes? Even a little bit?
Totally.
I've got to make them up to fall in love with them. Hey, let's face facts. I think what I tend to put into all of my heroes, and whether they're good ones or bad ones in my books, the male characters in the book, I give them a sense of honor, a sense of direction, and that sort of thing to me is something that I guess is important in my own life. So the characters that I love have the same values as I do, I guess, but to try to put them or put them into a male character and try to view the world from his point of view, certainly when he starts to talk to you about what he wouldn't do, then you get a real picture of him. And so sometimes you do sort of think, oh, geez, don't mind you, where'd you come from? That sort of thing. And I guess I do like my characters, and that is something I try to convey as well.
Yeah, I agree. I know I'm 100% swoon-worthy in love with all my heroes. Alec is an interesting hero because he's an engineer, and he was a bit of a dare from my husband, who many of you probably know is an engineer, and he reads more romance than I do. And he said, "Why is there never an engineer in romance?" Well, hello. And so Alec turned out to be a dare. I bet you can't write an engineer hero. So yes, no, my husband is not a tall, handsome Scot, but he is a tall, handsome South Australian. So, bless him. Yes. So yes, of course I say I'm in love with all my heroes. But yeah, no, I'm much more in love with my heroes than my heroines. I struggle with the girls much more than I do with the boys. Oh, we've got a few questions coming in. Are you on top of those, Nicola? Yeah.
There's one here from Gel Cell. I'm not quite sure what's being asked, so I think maybe that can be one that we do live at the end.
Yeah. And there's one from Lou
Oh,
to...
you're frozen, Alison.
Oh, I've frozen?
Yeah, well, no, you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
I think I fiddled with my mouse. There's one from Lou to Darry. When Finn says the bushranger has surrendered when he's in bed with Nell, that was maximum swoon. Oh, that was from The Widow of Ballarat. I just don't know what question.
Yes, I had to think about that for a minute. Where was I? Which book was I? Where am I?
How many bushrangers do you have?
Well, in The Widow of Ballarat, and I think Rachel has just finished reading that one. Have you? In The Widow of Ballarat, Finn, this is set just on the morning after the Eureka Stockade, when there were still bushrangers roaming the country and doing their thing. And so Finn bails up a coach, and of course he's got his kerchief, so we can't really see who he is, but of course she knows who he is, you know. And I don't remember the line, the bushranger has surrendered, but damn right, fella, you did the right thing. So Finn is certainly a swoon-worthy hero, Lou. He certainly was, and very damaged.
No.
Well, or damaged in a physical sense, yeah.
Oh, I do like a wounded hero.
Literally.
I've got a Gel Cell has now summarised the question, and it is: do you read kissy scenes from books you own to help you write the ones for your own books?
No.
No, no, I have the engineer to practice on. Sorry,
Sorry, David, I don't
just
have an engineer to
Too
practice.
much information.
just
I'll
all I
just have
can.
another glass of wine.
He's got his back to me, so I can't see what he's saying. There's no coincidence that I've turned to writing murder lately.
Well,
So,
speaking of murder, both your books, both your most recent books and others that I've read, feature men willing to do very bad things for money, as it comes down to it. Is it fun writing the bad guys?
Yes. And killing them off. If they're the really bad ones. I love that bit. I love that bit where they are so bad that there's only one way to deal with them, and that's to knock them off. And this is one way I can do that. I see so many bad guys out there now that I just like to knock off. Of course, I'm not allowed to, but I can in this framework, and I love it. So you don't want to see me on a dark night in the 19th century.
I agree. I love writing bad guys. The danger with a bad guy, though, is to make them a caricature, just make them wholly and totally bad. I think to make a really good bad guy, you have to give them a redeeming feature, even if it's just they're nice to their dog. You know, they can't, nobody, well, I'm a Pollyanna. I like to think there's good in everybody, but I mean, there's some really bad guys out there. But I do like to see my bad guys get their comeuppance. And yeah, the one in the Postmistress, yeah, I did well. I really got rid of him, burned him, died. But yeah, they get their comeuppance.
Speaking of death, you also both kill off good characters who the audience likes. Alison, most notably in The Goldminer's Sister, you start off a very popular character from The Postmistress had just died. When I told people in the office at Harlequin about this, there were looks of horror, not because they thought it was the wrong thing to do in a book, but they were really attached to that character.
Yeah. It's
what was it like to kill the good guys?
Like, it's not easy. My writers group, a couple of whom are here today, are probably smiling into their sleeves because it's a bit of a thing with me. Never get attached to my secondary characters. Yeah, it's hard to kill a nice character, but and I'm in real trouble with one reader in particular. I don't know if Jane's here today, but she keeps sending me messages saying, "You killed Will Penrose," and on the conversation's been going. Yeah, sorry about that.
We don't want spoilers, though.
Yeah, no spoiler. Well, he died, you know, it's obvious he's dead in the first chapter, so that's all right. Yeah, so yes. I like killing secondary characters because it does add to the pathos of the whole book. It gives the hero and heroine a genuine sort of situation they have to react against, even if it's grieving. Which obviously for Eliza, she is grieving her brother terribly, and but then there's a whole mystery around his death. And if I hadn't killed him, I wouldn't have a story. So. Sorry about that. So yes, don't get attached to my secondary characters because they do die. The problem comes when you have killed off a character and your editor then says, but we need another book. And I actually had to resurrect a character I had killed at the end of one book to make him the hero of the next book. That was a bit awkward.
What about you, Darry?
I don't actually set out intending to kill until the bad guy really does something, gets right up my nose, and I think, you know what, you just got to go.
But what about when you kill a good character?
That always surprises me, and that might surprise everyone else.
Yeah, when you're upset about Nebo.
We, the collective that's in here, comes to a point in the story where something has to happen, and generally for me it's that cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. So what would be the most likely scenario here? Whoops. And sometimes I can be a little bit mercenary. Well, in order to move the story forward, someone's got to go. And We can't knock off the heroine, oh my Lord, and we can't knock off who we really know is the hero of the book. It's got to be somebody else. So often it surprises me as much as it surprises everyone else. But that's what I love about how it works for me. And it comes to me after a good sleep. It comes to me as a whole chapter in a dream, and I just know exactly where to put that cliffhanger, but not always who it is that gets knocked off.
Wow, that's extraordinary. We have a question about language from Carol, and it is, what are your thoughts on the use of language, 1850 vocabulary presented for modern day readers? Do you do the kind of, what's that series at the moment, The Great, where we have characters in Russia in the 18th century saying okay and etc.? How do you deal with that?
Personally, I can't read it if our characters are minorities, you know, all that sort of rubbish. I can't. So I might give him an inflection in an important piece of dialogue that we might sort of mention 6 or 7 pages along, but the character does have, the reader does have that character's voice in the head. Generally speaking, I've learned when I look at my own work that if there is a secondary character with an accent or dialogue of the day, I will generally drop a G off the ing word, or I give him a little bit rough language or tone of voice or whatever. I never have lived in the 1850s, so I wouldn't know how they spoke to each other. When we look at what sort of letters they wrote to each other, they weren't exactly the same as what their dialogue would have been. So you sort of have to wing it with the reader in mind, that you don't want them to be leapt out of the story by trying to follow what this poor old character is trying to say. So I don't try and emulate what my idea of 1850 vocab might have been, or even try to pick it up from anywhere else. The thing I love about listening to a character who's in Russian speaking his own language, when we're looking at that, it needs to be in word perfect English, because he wouldn't be speaking in a broken language, a broken accent in his own language. So I just have to try and make sure that when he's speaking, secondary character or primary character, that I'm getting a clear picture of what he sounds like without hitting the reader over the head with it.
Yeah, and I think I agree totally with that. The trick is not to use a modern language like okay and hi and all of that sort of thing. So to try and keep it a very neutral kind of language that is readable. Like you, I try to give indications of accent. Like I'll say that Nettie has a Yorkshire accent, and I'll try and twist a few of the words just as a Yorkshire person would twist them. Alec, of course, is Scottish, and I was not going to go through the entire book going, oh, hi, the new, it's a raw bro, neat the new. So Alec speaks properly. And the fact that I say he's Scottish is, I hope, enough for readers to mentally give him the Scottish accent as they're reading it. I mean, that's kind of what I want to do, is paint the picture for the readers to draw their own conclusions. Because of course people didn't really speak with Australian accents at the time we were writing. Most of them were new immigrants, so they would have been bringing with them, whether they were I mean, the poor audio girl who's done the Goldminer's Sister, I've got Welsh, I've got Cornish, I've got Scottish, I've got Yorkshire. You know, everybody brought with them their own accents, and probably the only one who has the closest to being an Australian accent is Tian, who's from Tasmania and had an Irish father, so he speaks even with a slight Irish brogue. So yeah, you just give suggestions and hope that the reader picks it up. But in terms of actually writing it, it's to make it readable and to avoid using obvious modern anachronistic language.
Sure. I'm going to move along because we've got a couple of other
A lot of questions
from people. So Do you have an international audience? Happy Valley Books has asked that, and so did someone else earlier. Do you have international fan bases or an international audience?
I have a small one. I can tell that from the Amazon reviews. I'm getting quite a few Amazon reviews in from the US. I already had I already had a bit of a following in the US of my earlier books anyway. So they're following me along, which is good. But yeah, it's kind of encouraging. But sort of the feeling I get probably from my agent more than anyone else is that my books are very Australian and slightly inaccessible for Americans. I don't know if your experience is different, Darry.
Well, over the years, we've come to understand that the American market, now whether that's the gatekeepers or not, I'm not sure, just not interested in our Australian stories. So I don't think I have an international audience, but Phil and Craig, if you've got any little toggles you can work and get us out there, that would be really wonderful. I think the OSFIC historical fiction that we're writing, and there's a number of us now doing well in the Australian market, I think I think there's an opportunity for us to get our books out there into a market that would be welcoming of Australian fiction. I just don't know what that would be. And if we've already mentioned the US market, it's not the only market in the world. And right now it's probably not the best one, but if we could get our books out there, I'm sure they would translate really, really well, certainly by way of characters and history.
Yeah, I've never managed to get any traction in the UK market, even though that seems like a more natural fit, as you say. I don't know what you have to do there.
I think UK is actually harder than US.
Yeah, I think so. They're more sort of insular, I think. Yeah.
Okay, and we have a question from Michelle Elliott. Do you think you might collaborate on a historical novel together?
It's a very short answer, Michelle. Very short answer. Not at this point, anyway.
Not at this point. I think. We're both extremely busy. I think is probably the more to it, and maybe more sort of a kind of a collaborative project in individual books. But Darry and I have very different styles, as you probably appreciate. I'm not sure how, even though we're great mates and we've known each other for 100 years, I'm not sure how well we'd go. Sort of, it'd be a very strange.
Very different styles.
It would be a Franken book. Yeah.
So Michelle.
So I did want to ask, what are you working on next or now? And then I think we should go over to audience questions.
Absolutely. Well, you're very busy, Darry. What are you doing?
Right this minute, I think I calculated that I'm on book 9 for Harper Collins. So
wow. Congratulations.
That surprised me as well. Mind you, it hasn't been submitted or accepted or anything like that. But the story that's due out in November, December this year is called The Last True Heart. And that is my first foray into, is it time slip or something where there's two timelines?
Dual timeline.
A dual,
yeah. 1865 in Melbourne, and then 1895 or 98 in Geelong and Sydney. So that's coming out November, December. Then the one for July of next year is about to undergo edits. And that is to do with a young woman who comes back from England after studying for her master's degree, back from Scotland actually, and she's interested in forensic science, which was just an emerging science in the day, so right on 1900. And then this next one for the end of next year, so I can't even remember, but I've started it. I'm 5,000 words in. Yes, the mind of a writer. So I don't really know where I am at the moment, but I'm having lots of fun and I'm going to keep going. So I'm busy and I'm loving it.
That's great. You are busy. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say, but I'm hoping there is going to be a third Maidens Creek story, but it'll be a little bit different. because my plan is to take the action forward 20 years and involve a couple of characters from the 2 books that will come together, and it will be their story. But I really can't say anything more about that because it's in the big house at the moment being considered. So I've got that on the back burner, and closure is Nicola. But of course, I also write historical mysteries as A.M. Stuart, and the 3rd book in the Harriet Gordon mystery series has just been picked up by Penguin in New York. So that's there as well. Even though I said I'm only going to write 1 book, I'm back to writing 2 books a year. So I'm fingers crossed for the Harper Collins story, and we'll see what happens.
Absolutely, yeah. Got your back. And congratulations on that the American pickup. That's just terrific news.
Thank you very much. Yes, as I said, my thoughts have turned to murder in more recent years. So I'm kind of hoping that the last Maiden's Creek story might spin into a bit of a Melbourne set historical mystery. Anyway, we'll see what happens.